It's always this technological arms race. And in insurance, you're always trying to fight against anti-selection, right? If one of your competitors can identify a trait that you can't, then you won't even know why. You won't be able to tell why your results are deteriorating, right? You'll only know that they're doing better, but you can't tell why because you can't differentiate between your customers.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is Mario DiCaro, VP of Capital Modeling and Analytics at Tokyo Marine HCC Insurance Holdings. Mario, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here, Ankur. Nice to see you.
So for the sake of our audience, could you just describe a little bit of what you do today at Tokyo Marine?
I had a few teams, capital modeling team, lead a kind of their large project is a quarterly update of all of our capital modeling results that get presented to the executives here. Then the other teams that I manage are all predictive analytics focused, updating models on an annual or some of them almost quarterly basis for the various lines of business that we cover.
What does it mean in the world of insurance to do capital modeling? I mean, I think all of us in the audience have purchased insurance, we're policyholders, but a lot of what happens behind the scene is a little bit of a black box. So, could you explain a little bit more of how this fits into the bigger puzzle?
Capital modeling doesn't necessarily affect the policyholder very much at all. It's really an exercise that's designed to give people at an executive level of the company a view of a way to compare the various risks that the company faces and the investment decisions that they have. So, for example, there's just imagine a company that has 2 lines of business, right? Say they sell auto insurance, which is kind of a high volume type business. If there's a claim, it gets paid out pretty fast, versus let's say some type of casualty or workers' comp is a good example, right? Workers' comp, if you have then you have a workers' compensation line of business, you're selling policies that are going to take years to settle if there's a claim. And so there needs to be some way for the business to decide, well, how are these performing? How do you even compare them? Is it fair to compare them? And so over the years, this exercise, it's a whole profession really of people who now build these models and you present these results so that you have risk adjusted returns, right? So you're not just looking at net income on an annual basis, you're looking at net income over the life of an endeavor, as well as comparing that to the capital that gets tied up by being engaged in that and the risks associated with it. So that's kind of what it does there. The other one is looking at risk from a total level. How do these 2 lines of business, how are they correlated? Because a lot of times companies are looking to diversify their risk by going into different lines of business. And hopefully they don't all have losses at the same time, right? You know, so they offset each other and it just kind of stabilizes the whole operation. So one of the big exercises the capital modeling team does is they're constantly doing research to understand the economic linkages between different lines of business. COVID, for example, came out of left field and created claims in lots of strange ways people hadn't expected.
I think that's a beautiful description. I think to kind of use an analogy in some ways, as an individual, for example, you're managing an investment portfolio and you have different assets and they perform in different ways depending on what type of asset it is, right? Some are maybe short-term volatile and short-term yielding. Others are meant to go and stabilize longer-term trajectories that you might have from an investment horizon perspective. And when you look at these insurance products, I think they do operate
on different time frames, and some are high velocity, some are lower velocity, they vary in premiums and payouts and such. It's inherently very complex, and I think modeling that complexity um, is pretty challenging, right? And I think maybe turn to a different question. When you think about AI, and I guess there are different forms of AI. Would love for you to help unpack that. But the prior generations, which include predictive modeling and such, machine learning, now you see a lot of generative AI. And for something that's inherently very complex, like capital modeling, where have you seen the most inroads to date, either from the prior generation of models and then also the more recent generative AI that you see?
When I first came to HCC, I've been here a long time, it's 11 years now. I only had responsibility for the capital modeling team, right? And a good friend of mine, Tim, had predictive analytics, which was also a small team at that time. And we would look at each other's work and talk about, oh, well, what could we do? He was building models that looked to me like I could use them in capital modeling, or he was using techniques that I thought, oh, we could apply that technique. And so we were learning his predictive analytics techniques and realizing, the volume of observations you need to build a proper model and all this. And so for years, we just kind of were just friends and found our work interesting, but there wasn't much overlap that we could do. Even in the area of NLP, the NLP work we could do then was s- not very good, with the data we had at hand. Um, but now that the generative AI, it's just fascinating how good it is at reading stuff. And that's the only way I can really put it is any task we have that involves reading and interpreting, and even now converting that into very structured, we can take very unstructured stuff and turn it into very structured stuff very fast with pretty high accuracy. Right. Sorry, I actually lost track of the question you asked, Donker.
No, no, I think that's super helpful that you've been able to introduce different technologies along the way around some of this. So what does that do in terms of making your work on the capital modeling side, let's say, easier because you have predictive modeling as well as the structuring of information using generative AI. How does that lead to better, let's say, business outcomes or work experiences for you and your team?
In capital modeling, I think it's going to have the impact of, and this is purely speculative because practically the only real impact I've seen so far is in it's helping with documentation. It helps people write faster and write things that are easier to read with fewer errors, which we already had spell check and all that, but these new tools are just better. And then of course, automating workflows. I think eventually it's going to start helping us with our checklists. It would be nice if someday when we get to these, vertical AI agents, that we can just give them a list of things that we check. We have these extensive checklists when we do our work, that we've learned the hard way of what things we need to keep an eye out for. And it would be nice if we could just give that whole checklist to some AI agent that would do all the things we already know to check so that we can spend our time looking at other stuff. We're quite a ways away from that right now, I think, at least in that space. I know in other spaces where there's a lot of money to be made, people will show up and have systems that can do that. But capital modeling, for as high impact as it might be, there's very few people that are involved in it, right? You only need a handful of people for any corporate entity, whether that corporate entity has 5,000 employees or 200. It's kind of the same workload, you know.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. So you need fewer people, but then the work itself is very complex. And so by having this technology, it seems like for example, with the documentation bit, it makes the lives of these individuals easier. What does it mean for the organization? Does it mean that you're getting to better outcomes, you're getting to better analysis more quickly? Is it a quality of work improvement for the team primarily? I'm trying to figure out how, for example, we should look at the advent and use of this AI as being beneficial to the broader organization. And it's completely fine if it's just more or less just improving the lives of the employees, but you're trying to map it to the organizational level as well.
Yeah, I don't see it having an impact yet on the actual delivery end, like the experience that the people they're reporting to have. Someday, I think it will, but that will be a more broad. For example, let's say the CEO has a question about what's happening in our Fitch rating or something. Why did this number go up by 20%? Rather than that question working its way down through the chain of people to figure out who can answer the detailed question on that. She'll likely in the future just ask her AI agent, maybe named Connor or whatever. Actually, hey, Connor, find out why the Fitch number went up by 20% in that report. And Connor will have access to all those documents along with the knowledge of how they're created and what understand the context of that. And if it's an easy question to answer, Connor will just answer her. And if not, then Connor will be the one asking us, right? I'm almost certain that's going to happen in pretty near future.
I think that's right. I mean, we're seeing this in the world of consumers where they're using ChatGPT, Perplexity, and the like to ask questions and get answers back super fast to the point where, anecdotally speaking with a lot of people and friends and such, they're turning to like conventional search engines like Google less because they don't have the time of the day to go and hit 10 links and try to find the right answer. They want it right there at their fingertips. And I think that you could imagine a assistant like this working at an enterprise level that is able to get linked into lots of different sets of knowledge, right? Lots of documents, lots of databases, and then supply really good grounded responses back. Or if the AI agent is not able to um, get to the right answer, then at least it could ping the right party or the right unit to go and ask for clarifying details, then pull that context together to, like, let's say, the CEO in this case. And then also, I think in the enterprise use case, you do need to trace sort of where that information came from,
Yep.
what led to that outcome. So it's not just providing a response; it needs to
Yep.
be completely traced with a log. But I think we will start seeing that. I mean, that is the enterprise version that I think a lot of enterprises are looking for because now all of a sudden you can get enterprise institutional knowledge super fast with very little intervention from human operators.
I agree. And I agree that that lineage, like that might become where there's standardization, right? in order in order for us to start building tools, and it happens in every industry that's new, right? Eventually there becomes this standardization. Like that's how we ended up with what HTTP and all these different protocols, right? And Bluetooth. It's another example. Eventually there will be some type of agentic communication protocol. And I bet you're right. I bet it'll include information lineage so that as the answer progresses through the chain of agents that will for sure there will be a network of agents talking to each other and they'll have to pass along like, how do you know that? How do you know that? That'll be
Yeah, that's right.
interesting.
That's right. That's right. That's the exactly right. And I think you're seeing that with a chain of thought or reasoning models like a O1 from OpenAI or an R1 from DeepSeek, right? You're seeing that in the consumer world where you might make one call, but it's spinning out, it like flares out dozen or more calls underneath to get enough context, and then it commingles and collates all of that information into a final response and then references back to where that information came from. That's exactly what will happen and is happening in enterprise. Is just that it's orders of degrees more complex. You have to have private siloed data integrated nicely. And then the importance for having that log is really critical, right? And I think this is all around generating responses or generating content. Um, but I do want to turn back to something you mentioned earlier, which is reading in information, right? And that could be unstructured or semi-structured. So, in this world that you're in, it could be, for example, interpreting complex financial and legal documents to then parse the numerical information, maybe create functional models like cash flow models and such. So, where is this easy to do, and what are the open challenges there right now?
All right. You wanted a story. So here's a story of something that failed. When a lot of us were new, when GPT was new and there's still excitement and there was still funding, right? People were still willing to throw money at stuff. That's kind of drying up. We kicked off this project with one of our units that has they sell a product that's backed by the government and the rates are set by the government as well as the contract terms. It's a federal program. And what happens is every year they will either create new products or they change the terms in numerous contracts or numerous products. And those get pushed out from the government as PDFs. Right? It's not like they just send out a nice Python formula or any language would be preferable to a PDF. But anyway, it comes in a PDF. And so we have a large team of developers in that business unit who their whole job basically is to take these documents from the government and convert them into affected their cash flow models, right? They're like, here's the premium, here's the potential losses, and this is exactly how you calculate what the payout will be based on the selections of the insured. So day in and day out, they're doing this. And one of the first use cases was like, wow, wouldn't it be awesome that GPT could read those contract changes, compare it to the old contract language, and look up in our code where that's being done and tell us exactly how to modify the code. Everybody's like, oh yeah, that'd be awesome. so so we get going on that, and it was okay. It wasn't, uh, I think they got to the point where they could find the place in the code that needed to be changed. They could make a few suggestions. But what came out of it though, one of the biggest benefits was the development team, because I guess it was still early days of GPT. I don't doubt there's a developer out there that wouldn't attest to how good these tools are at coding. But back then, they hadn't really seen it in action. And the takeaway for them, I was talking to them afterwards, they're like, well, it wasn't very good at changing the code, but it's very, very good at helping us update stuff. So I know that they basically started using it all the time to help them modify stuff. Basically, they just started using what we all know as just Copilot in VS Code, right? Man, it's like magic. It's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. It speeds up the process. I mean, you still need good design principles. You still need to know what to build, but it can help facilitate that, right? And I think eventually you will have, basically more complete co-pilots on the coding front where it can help you ideate on what to build, or think of the alternative ways of kind of building it out. So it's like more strategic in nature. But right now, as a kind of a coding assistant, it's incredible. It helps programmers get work done more quickly. And I think one thing we've seen, at least with work with customers on our side, is it pays to experiment. Now, the experiments need to be nicely scoped out. You still need to do, a priori before you begin the work, like do some legwork and make sure these are bets worth taking. But the more you do, the more you learn. Not all of them pan out, right? But the price to pay, as long as it's more manageable, ends up helping facilitate better outcomes in the long haul, because your velocity of learnings is, ends up being materially higher than another organization's.
I agree. You have to try stuff.
For you and Tokyo Marine, HCC, which of course is a very large organization with a huge footprint around the world, and how does activity around AI get coordinated? Does it happen at like the team or department level, and each team department works independently, so it's more decentralized, or is there more of a consolidated approach around basically the AI strategy, and then how you farm that out to different teams? Hey there, very quickly. We just released a new agentic AI platform that makes it possible to automate very complex knowledge work. Our platform makes it far easier to set up multi agent systems that allow you to coordinate work across AI agents, human supervisors, and third party systems. This is the future of agentic AI, helping people get work done more quickly, adding more efficiency and productivity and better customer experiences. So if you're interested in agentic AI and what it could do for your organization, please book time with our team today.
It's interesting. I'm probably not the one, you know, best suited to answer in detail. We're a very federated structure. Both at HCC has a number of business units, and then Tokyo Marine even further, right? There are numerous companies all over the country or all over the world as part of our international group. And it's interesting. I have a lot of friends at those other companies because we get to know each other. Tokyo Marine's very good about bringing us together within our different professions and to discuss different problems. And there will be guidance. There are some rules, right? Some things have rules and other things have guidance, but that's all communicated. And there's a lot of communication, like feedback loops, right? Where Tokyo Marine head office is trying to collect as much feedback as possible from the group companies and then find the way that everybody wants to work together, and then that turn that into the guidance or the rules that will then monitor and try to keep coordinated. But largely, the companies are self-governing, self-operating, and then so in the space of AI, there's very specific guidance from Tokyo Marine, and everybody has their policies at their different whatever jurisdiction they operate in, and then those policies get shared, of course, with Tokyo Marine.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine how complex it gets around some of that,
It's
and it differs
it's interesting.
Sorry, Mario, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yes, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it differs enterprise by enterprise. I mean, we come across some that are it's much more centralized and they like it that way, and maybe it slows down the process. But then when they make a decision, they are able to roll it out all at once everywhere. And then the other way, which is basically you have like decisions made at more of a team level, and so it kind of rolls up, and there's sharing of information, and of course, like those are not just like two ends of the spectrum, but you can have something in between where there's some sharing, but there's also some encouragement of testing and trying at the team level. So it's pretty fascinating to see. So I think what we've talked about is predictive modeling being helpful, creating of documentation, co-pilots on the coding side being helpful. Let's talk a little bit about AI generated content, right? Maybe the original use case of generative AI. Um, I think you've mentioned this in conversations with us where you anticipate maybe a surge of mediocre AI content. So there's going to be a lot more content. And then the question is, how will that affect the work that you do as
Yeah.
capital market professionals?
I don't know. It's actually something that I wonder about sometimes while I'm driving, right? Like in my own personal work, I'm able to generate a lot more text-based work than I was before. Whether it's coding or writing something to send to someone. Um, because it's all limited by my own speed, I'm not really generating much more than I would without it. It's just better quality. It's more finished when it's done. But it's still kind of at human speed. Other things that are being automated at computer speed, right? Where you take lead generation or just the emails, the volume of emails that we're going to get, I think is going to multiply. We already get a lot of automated submissions depending on the line of business, and I'm sure that's going to grow drastically. And I can't even imagine what's going to happen on the claim side. Like there's already fraudulent claims come or people try, just there's going to be a bigger flood of fraud claims, or they'll just be harder to detect. It's always this technological arms race. And in insurance, it's always this you're always trying to fight against anti-selection, right? If one of your competitors can identify a trait that you can't, then you won't even know why. You won't be able to tell why your results are deteriorating, right? You'll only know that they're doing better, but you can't tell why because you can't differentiate between your customers. One of the things that I really think is going to happen is with this speed of in this like on this topic of anti-selection, right? When the submissions come in, we already have a lot of automations in place, like you're getting to with machine learning and predictive analytics. A submission comes in pretty quickly. We start to score it to see like, oh, you should charge more for this or less for this, relative to some base rate. And in a lot of workflows, uh, those indicators go to a human first, and they got to get in line because the humans can only work so fast. And so then the human makes a decision, and finally a quote goes out. Well, if somebody else goes faster at that and ships, and this already happens, but sends out their quotes on the good business faster, well, that's more likely where the good business is going to go. And so this process of increasing the volume just makes that game even more important to automate whatever you possibly can reliably automate, it's just because of the competitive nature of things.
Yeah, it's incredible to see. I think with more AI generated content, you're able to get basically a deluge of requests and submissions and claims and such. And then it's almost like that then requires you to have more AI built out to then
Yep,
interpret it. And you're seeing that in the
exactly.
consumer world where, basically more and more content on social, let's say, is AI generated. And then you need AI to interpret the deluge of information there to respond to it. And maybe you have some that's there are auto responses. So a point where you can't even tell sometimes what's AI generated versus what's not. Like over time, I think the lines do start to blur. But it doesn't solve for the fact that there's now 10x the volume of content that's coming through, right? And it's in your side of the house, so the capital modeling side. How can you prepare yourself and your team and the company at large to handle this substantial deluge of AI driven requests and submissions that are coming through in order to go in, not have to hire like 10x more people given the volume that you're seeing?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I haven't given it a ton of thought on the capital modeling side. I think we need to come up with ways to monitor first at the volume of what's AI generated and to even be able to start to tell whether it matters or not. Maybe it doesn't matter since a big part of the goal is to mimic what a person would have done, right? Yeah, I don't know. Like in the news we read, gosh, the statistics I'm seeing is something like a third of the news articles you might read now, even if they're reviewed by a person, they're generated by AI, right? And it's only been a couple years. It's crazy. So, and so somehow we need to figure out how to at least keep track of this stuff so that we can understand just the scope of the issue and then start to measure whether it's associated with claims. Because that's what really matters is if the AI generated stuff is somehow associated with a different variety of claims or bulk of claims, then that's something that have to factor into the models. Or one of my colleagues today pointed out, he said, hey, well, a lot of people might be basing their investing decisions off of AI. And what if it's giving a lot of people the same suggestion? Well, then you get an accumulation, right? I mean, that alone would start driving a bubble.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And I think in the case of claims, when something gets easier to do, so like AI is helping you file a claim more quickly, you're going to see a higher volume of claims, just generally. And then the question is, how many of these claims are legitimate? Let's say some are more fraudulent in nature, and then you have to go and identify which are fraudulent. But it may be that you might even see an uptick in the number of legitimate claims because, frankly,
Mhm.
it's easier to file a claim in the first place. But then you basically need to figure out, how do you go and handle that? And it can be a tricky scenario where if you have to hire a lot of people to then go and respond to claims, then you might not be able to hire quite as quickly, right? And then you have to think about using software to sift through the claims that are coming in and help improve the search process and then make the lives of the claims adjudicator more easier over time through technology. So I think there is like this good cop, bad cop, or like bad actor, good cop type of scenario where one behavior then changes the behavior of the receiving party, and you have to go back and forth. And I think you're going to have to see that in most enterprises because I think this technology it doesn't it will affect basically every single workflow, every single department. And I think consumers are going to start adopting it sooner in many ways than enterprise, but enterprises will then
I
have to
agree.
respond in kind.
Yeah. I think consumers will get it first because we, I mean, Gmail was better than corporate email for years. I mean, the Gmail junk mail filter is still better than my company. I still get more junk mail at work than I do in my personal account.
Yep, exactly. Well, from a capital modeling perspective, what are some of the most significant new risks? Some which you've spoken about, but curious what others do you see that's being introduced by this widespread adoption of AI?
I don't know that it's all speculative. Right? Like, there's not much. We had a few claims associated with what were they in the, in the climate change area, there was what they called greenwashing, right? Where you saw claims associated with that, where a company would go out and talk about all the great things they're doing, for nature. And then it turned out they weren't, and they would get sued. So similar things were happening with AI, where a company was going out and saying they had such and such capabilities, and that was driving up investments, and then that turned out to be false. And so yeah, we ended up with, or at least claims were in the news. I don't think we had much problem with it. But as far as what you're talking about of real risks associated, I don't know. What have you heard? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's misinformation, and this is less on the claim side, but like if you look at insurance as a whole, maybe not specifically capital modeling, but if policyholders or would-be policyholders are trying to identify which policies make most sense for them. They're doing their own kind of shopping or diligence or whatnot, and you could get sometimes incorrect answers back. So you think you're covered for X, Y, Z because you're running the
Mm.
kind of the quote or something through AI, and the AI misses something and doesn't understand the context enough, and then the party runs with it like, "This quote looks great, let's go." It's, like, cheaper, materially cheaper, but they missed the fine print or they missed the exception clauses, something that, if they actually read the document themselves or had a broker go through, they would have, basically gotten better answers on. So, I think trusting AI as a consumer is tricky. Sometimes it can work beautifully, but I think it leads to kind of blinders on the really important decisions. You hear basically people turning to AI for legal advice, right? Even in business context, like they'll run legal docs for a very like complex like vendor relationship or kind of a relationship like that, and then they're not going through lawyers to go do something. They're like, hey, lawyers are going to kind of charge a lot of money, and it's much easier to throw it against the model. But sometimes that doesn't work out well, right? It's
Yep.
like kind of the gray area or the abnormal language is a little bit harder to interpret by like a generalist AI. And then you see that problem also in healthcare, right? Which is like people are asking questions and the AIs in general like responds with a lot of confidence. It's like, yes, this is the answer, and here's a, B, C, D, and it gives you all these reasons, and it gives you 50 different reasons of why this should be the case. And then you feel like, wow, like this AI really knows and did the homework, and I should run with it. But I would say there should be a degree of caution because AI can be faulty, just like humans can be, even though AI is a little bit more. Let's say it expounds a bit more on reasons why and such. So I think that could lead to tricky interactions in terms of people selecting policies or shopping for policies, and I think that can get really tricky, right? For some of the very important decisions that we as individuals need to make. And you mentioned in investments, same thing. It's sometimes you need to do the homework yourself, and if you look for shortcuts or feel like AI is like God around some of this, that could lead to some problematic outcomes in the long run.
Yeah. It's funny, one of the first things I tried when, actually, I started using Gen AI. I didn't use it, but I learned of it before ChatGPT, like, showed up because a colleague of mine said, "Hey, go check out this thing called Jasper." Like, "Okay." And I looked at Ja and blew my mind. I didn't even know things like that were being built. And then, a few months later, ChatGPT showed up, and I thought, "Oh, that's really interesting." And I gave it a kind of a classic actuarial problem of trying to they call it, they do like these loss projections based on this triangle data, right? So that we always use the word triangles, figure out a reserve estimate based off this triangle. So I give it that. And just like you said, it came back and because of the level of confidence it spoke with, I found myself just thinking, wow, this is amazing. It can do this until I read the details of the solution it had put together. And it was total nonsense. It was not total nonsense, but it was definitely wrong, right? It was using words in the wrong way, and it definitely was terrible at math. So that was eye opening for me. Just that exactly what you just talked about, a very high level of confidence tied to complete gibberish. And you don't see that in people very often, right? If people aren't sure, they'll be like, I don't know, maybe. But you're right, it hardly ever responds that way. And I wish we could somehow train it to do that. Like in a lot of the models we build, like the machine learning models, there's a level of confidence associated with the responses. And I've seen that. I have seen people where you can get the LLM, you can extract the level of confidence for certain things, I guess. I haven't seen it much though. And I don't know, I haven't seen an example where they convey the level of confidence in the response itself, where it would respond, say, well, I kind of think this might be the way to do it. It never seems to do that.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I think AI right now responds with a lot of confidence, even when it shouldn't be that supremely confident. And it does it so in a way where it delineates exactly, where that information came from. So like it did all the homework, it checked for everything. Like maybe I should like trust the confidence that this AI has. And I think what we need to do is basically help it respond in the way that a human would, which is it should tell you where it's less sure, where it's less confident, where it would actually probably behoove you to do more diligence yourself. And I think that's really critical. I think these guardrails are really critical. The conference scores down to different like points in a bigger like decision or generation of output. Like it should give you fine grained confidence scores on different things that it considered, especially for many like LLM calls that are leading to final output. And the risk I see is like, I mentioned the consumer risk, which is policyholders like selecting policies based on information that was incomplete or potentially wrong because AI came up with it. And so there are some bad outcomes there. And then it's like, who's at fault? Was it the policyholder? Was it AI provider? Right? Is it like, yes, it's very, very tricky. But I think this is also what will happen within enterprise, which is like if you're like a claims adjudicator or underwriter, like we bought this software as an organization My team is using it. I'm using it. I ran with the response, and then it's like, whose fault is it? Is it the underwriter's fault? Is it like the carrier's fault? Is it the vendor, like the software vendor or the model providers? Who's at fault? Who's at risk? Who has a liability? Particularly if it leads to bad outcomes for the
Mhm.
policyholder, for example. So I think this is where it gets really tricky. These are risks all with like the use of AI,
Yeah.
and we're all new to using AI. I think AI is, in some ways, like, it's not like human at all. I think humans can do certain things that are easy for humans to do, and the same things are very hard for AI, and vice versa. Some things that AI does are incredibly hard for humans to do, but AI just excels. So, and it's a different type of intelligence as much as we want to think like it's the same or similar. It's not always correlated in all functional areas, and I think it will take time for us as humans to know when and where to trust AI, and I think that's going to be the next part of our journeys. How do we incorporate it properly into the work that we do?
Yeah. I think one of the things sometimes I try to imagine is kind of a weird thing to try to imagine, but I do try to imagine th- the word context. I never thought much about context window, right? It's totally changed the way I think about how I think. It's like, well, what's my context window? Because I know it's not 120,000 words. Some days it's 10 words. If we get past 10 words, I forget what we're talking about. But think about an AI, not only is its context window for words limited, and I think it actually has a bigger context window for words than we do by far. But that's the only context it has. Let's just stick with the LLMs. That's the only context it has. You're talking about, you're using words like intelligence for a thing that doesn't have the capacity to understand anything except text. Like the only thing it has, just imagine locking yourself in a room and all you ever get to do is see strings of text, and all that's expected of you is to try to guess what comes next. And you're rewarded for that with more electricity. I don't know. I don't know exactly how that all works. You're just prodded to put out more text. And it's just so weird to me. Like, of course it doesn't answer right all the time. It doesn't have a clue it doesn't know what things look like. It doesn't know what things smell like. It has no context, right? It can't see the computer screen we're looking at. But I think soon enough, it will. I mean, you already see it with Operator, and they're feeding it screenshots so that it has context of what you're doing on your screen. And it won't be long before, the meta glasses and stuff are constantly looking everywhere. And your AI will just talk to you in your ear because it'll have a lot more context and it'll know what you're interested in.
That's right, and it's gonna be context not just from text, but also vision, right? So, like, if you're, office worker, what screens are you looking at? What are you trying to populate? It's learning, right? Capturing that information, that becomes part of the context, and so it's a multimodal context that's being used. I think it'll be pretty interesting to see sort of how that plays out. And I think turning back to capital modeling, what are some, misconceptions about AI in capital modeling that you'd like to address?
I haven't heard one yet. For whatever reason, that entire practice just completely flies under the radar. It just, as far as AI implications go, probably the biggest misconception would be that it's not impacted by AI, because I think that's for sure not true. I don't know of a single profession that's not impacted.
Yeah, but I do think that there are, different adoption curves and cycles, right? So I think that some of the simpler types of work, like generating blogs or social posts or emails or doing simple customer support requests, those are the ones who are getting hit the hardest in some ways, or like standard legal review, right? Legal is kind of getting shifted a good bit. The more complex the work you do, it's just a matter of time. It will get reshaped, to some degree, but it'll take a little bit longer, right? Because it's a degree more complex. It requires more context. It requires more integrations, more piping of information. Like, there's a lot more things that have to happen for that to be done well. Whereas, like, personalized email, it's easy. You give it, the name, the company, the profile of the company, and the individual, and you're saying like, "This is what I want to go and sell," or have them and encourage them to do, and then it's able to use that. So it's like easier to provide context. But if you do capital modeling, well, now you have complex documents. Some of the information might be in databases. There might be a lot of information across the board, and you can't squeeze that even to 120,000 token context window, right? And so it will get reshaped, but it might take a little bit longer than people expect. But hard to imagine any type of work that is not going to at least get affected in some way by AI. In terms of the temperature of the room, we're now 2+ years into the whole like ChatGPT, generative AI era. What's the temperature right now? Are people just as excited? Are they discouraged? Is it a little bit more cautious of an approach? I'm just
Oh,
curious
fun.
what it's like under the hood at an institution like yours, working with AI.
Yeah, one of my responses that I wrote up was right along that. Some people have definitely given up on it, I would say. Anyone I think who's given it a chance from just ChatGPT, right? Let's just say ChatGPT. Anyone who's given it a chance at their work ends up being hooked. Everybody I know who tries it ends up using it in one form or another. And every new thing they try it on, they'll find some corner of that problem that GPT is just really good at helping with. Okay, I'll give you an example. My son's taking coding classes at school, and you know, his sisters are real into drawing and stuff, and they were all up in arms about generative AI making pictures and all this, which I agree with, right? You don't, and then the whole copyright issues of it was trained on stolen image and all this stuff. And so I think a lot of people were like out of a political view almost would not touch it. No, not. Um, and my son and I were talking about something. I said, check this out. And I went into ChatGPT and I just gave it the prompt to generate a web page, a single page application, right? Generate a single HTML file that basically emulates Tetris because we were playing Tetris that day. And I said, watch this. And it did it. It had one little flaw where you couldn't see the blocks as they fell, and you point it out, and it goes, "Sure enough, yeah, let me update that." And this is with 0 code changes on our site. It was like a 3-page HTML file, worked fine. And he was then a believer and ended up putting Copilot into his instance of VS Code. And I can't remember what the last thing was. Oh, right now he's learned how to download the various open source models using Olama and test those out. And so he's on his way.
Yeah, I imagine everyone will be a believer at some point because they'll see the impact. But if you don't have the right introduction or the right initial experience, I could see how they hear one thing in the mainstream media and that your experience is dramatically different. You're like,
Yeah,
this is all hype. This is all BS. Like, I'm going to move on.
yeah,
But
some of it is.
yeah, some of it is absolutely right. That's right. And I think that's up to us to figure out like, where do we introduce it? How do we introduce it? How do we manage expectations? How do we guardrail against some of the risks, right? Which is really the bulk of the conversation. But Mario, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for being on the
Yeah.
show
You
and
too,
very
Ankur. Nice to
excited
see
to
you.
see what comes next.
Likewise. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Mario.